Now that the dust has settled and the conclusion of Attack on Titan has been fully released, I thought it prudent to give my own take on this incredibly contentious finale. I, the scriptwriter, have been a fan of Attack on Titan ever since I watched the first season in 7th grade of middle school, and from then I became attached to the series and was glad to see it mature and reveal itself as this cleverly written shonen epic, making my childhood nostalgia of sorts justified. As it reached chapter 121, my love for it peaked. An admittedly straightforward tale given great proportions and tackling sensitive issues with relative precision. I thought about it consistently, had my interpretations, theories, and so forth, even all the way up to chapter 138. Then, the last chapter hit. To me, honestly, I don't even see why there's divisiveness to this ending. And this video was spurred on by my own egregious points on the ending that I saw echoed nowhere, and to try and develop a final argument here, albeit with a fairly loose structure. My underlying thesis rests on the case that the ending has failed in every department that was previously set up by the story Eren established, from themes to characterization and the fundamentals of grand narrative itself. That not being meta-narrative, but just a narrative of a grand-scale story. I will begin with addressing the argument of general themes to the finale, and also ask the question, what is the theme of the ending? A grand narrative such as this requires there to be an overarching theme or set of themes that close out and provide a proper climax to its series. Otherwise, it's a failure. Across Attack on Titan, we are given a large set of ranging themes, yet I would agree there is, or at least was, a connecting principle between them all, which we will get into later. I have seen many ideas here about the ultimate theme of the series, particularly with the added panels, mostly resting in two things: the resolution of Mikasa's love, and the pervading sense of nihilistic fatalism, yet also Armin's Democritian ethics. It is often argued on these bases that this quote-unquote cycle has continued, will probably always continue, but that we can enjoy what good we have in our own short but sweet lives all the while. But has Attack on Titan truly ever been about enslaving love, nihilism, or fatalism? And is this truly even a nihilistic theme? What even is a quote-unquote repeating cycle? Is it violence? Revenge? Conflict? These are all very easily answered questions. To start with, let's make something very clear. Attack on Titan has never been a nihilistic series, and neither does the ending emphasize this either. Nihilism is essentially a rejection of life and its potential meaning. Yet, can we say that in Erwin's suicide charge, for example, he had simply given up on life and ascribed no meaning to his and his comrades' sacrifices? Not at all. He rebuked such nihilism in his grand speech by preaching about giving meaning to the fallen, of whom he places particular importance due to his own dilemma. In this instance as well, he is also speaking to himself, granting himself a meaning to his life that exists outside of the truth hidden inside the basement, one that could satisfy him just as much, if not more. Attack on Titan has consistently presented us with situations such as this in which characters are presented with seemingly impossible odds, ruinous setbacks, massive loss of life for seemingly no reason, but at no point do they surrender the pursuit of the struggle, even should they temporarily shirk. Levi's squad against a female Titan, Mikasa in trust upon learning that Eren has died, Bertolt resolving himself in Shiganshina, Ymir protecting Historia, Armin against Bertolt, and so many more. To watch all of this unfold and simply give up, prostrating oneself to death, would be a disservice. The idea of the Survey Corps itself was to push forward at all costs, for humanity rests on the balance if they do not. A soldier's life is not over until they give meaning to their lives. Through their efforts, they make slow progress at this and do achieve many things that save and protect their people and satisfy their own beings as well. The audience celebrates a new hint of truth to the central mystery of the Titans, not simply because of it being a new plot point to them, but because it justifies the Survey Corps' mission. We want them to win, and by proxy, we also want Paradis to survive, and the Eldians to regain their footing. The ending itself makes this a paradoxical point, and we can describe this to Isayama's own failures as a writer. It is not a nihilistic ending. Armin had previously spoken of his philosophy of enjoying and placing meaning in those small things of life. From reading a book to running with his friends with the wind in his hair. He is inherently putting meaning into his life's efforts, which is why confronting Zeke with this, the ultimate pessimist, who's encouraging him to give up on life and abandon the struggle, is relevant. Considering that the arc around this point takes embarrassingly written efforts to paint Armin as the savior figure, and that he sways Ymir with his speech, we have no reason to assume the ending is proving this to be the wrong position, and Armin gets to live out his life anyway. Isayama had also penned down the thoughts of his own that mirror Armin's disposition, but then it shows that the Alliance's efforts to bridge world peace has apparently failed, and that Paradis was apparently destroyed by invasion around 80 to 100 years in the future, judging from its technology, within just 3 whole textless panels. If Isayama were intended to get across this message through Armin as the theme of the finale, then he has tremendously failed, for it required him to brush away every piece of the puzzle and leave us with an anticlimactic ending. People have also attempted to excuse this by stating that due to its ambiguity, that it cannot be known the reason for this happening, and that this could have easily been from an unrelated war, such as a war over resources, or just anything that isn't related to Eldian racism. But this is clearly nothing more than an unrealistic cope for what is the only logical outcome of this last chapter. Starting from the beginning of the Marley arc, it is remarked specifically that Marley's war on Paradis is not driven by some simple racist hatred of Eldians, but from 2 things. 1. Eldia is a weak target that is rich in resources. The exceptional iceberg stones are brought up later on in Zeke's conversation with Kiyomi as the reason Historia even engages in diplomacy with them in the first place. Marley is an empire that is looking to preserve its position among the other world powers as seen with their war against the Mideast allied forces, so naturally they would gravitate towards attacking this place for a resource advantage. The other reason is the more dire one that prompts them into war, for Marley is behind the other world powers technologically, due to over-reliance on the Titans. As a result, they need the founding Titan to temporarily bridge the gap so that they may catch back up while still being in a dominant position. Thereafter, no longer needing the power of the Titans and by proxy, the Eldians. So, unmistakably, we could say that the war against Paradis is driven by 2 things: resources and power, the former merely being a way to preserve the latter. Racism is prevalent across the continent due to the storied history of the Eldian Empire, which is the subject of propaganda all across the world. Marley is remarked as being the most lenient of all nations on the Eldians and their rights, and I think no one would fault me here for saying that this is absolutely due to the fact that Marley possesses Titan shifters. Marley's propaganda efforts are to not only pacify the Eldians, but to control and direct Titan shifters for their war effort, so that they may quote-unquote repent for their history, but more importantly, win some rights for their family. They cannot rebel against Marley, for their family would suffer, and often the family is the most brainwashed, and would weep over having a traitorous child. For propaganda finds a target in Paradisian Eldians, as well as Marley's own full-fledged citizens. The Eldians of Paradis enjoyed a good 80 to 100 years of peace and luxury, while continental Eldians were left behind, not knowing that Eldians in Paradis had their memories taken away and were going through a unique kind of hell altogether. So, we could say that once and for all, the racism sustained by Eldians is part of a thoroughgoing effort for military empires to demarcate quote-unquote enemies and quote-unquote allies even within the Eldian race itself, on the continent and otherwise, and that this has deeply embedded itself culturally. May I remind you that we are dealing with 2,000 years of history that the continental races went through against the Eldian Empire, and subsequently teach onto the continuing generations to the point that we get people like Gabi and young Reiner even among the same race. With all of these details considered, the idea that in just 80 to 100 years, the continental people, who had just sustained a near-successful genocide from a race that they had already loathed for doing the same general thing to them for 2,000 years straight, would simply get over it because the Titan powers are gone is absolutely ridiculous. The Titan powers were never the true reason for racism. It was for the people due to history and because of military propaganda. And for the governments themselves, part of an effort to best preserve enemy targets for their people to rally against, so as to expand and strengthen their imperial ambitions. Armin and the Alliance cannot just talk their way out of something that was culturally built into an entire people and strengthened upon the coming of the Rumbling, which made their fears true. The only thing that would change is the Eldians would no longer have quote-unquote devil blood, meaning they would no longer be militarily useful. And this was also an idea for why Marley's technological catch-up would doom the Eldians as well. The Founding Titan would give them the opportunity to wipe them out easily. Furthermore, we could see that the buildings destroyed in this war are left to rot and decay. If this were some surviving nation, it would have been rebuilt. So there is only one reason why Paradis would be destroyed by foreign invasion, and it would be the same reason why, from the very start as well, it's what is relevant to the story. The Titan power is apparently also dormant. The cycle has continued fully. But what is this cycle? People have hopped on to the misconception that this was simply the quote-unquote cycle of conflict, and that beforehand Eren's plan was popularly believed to be ultimately ending human conflict. This is naturally false. The cycle that was to be abolished and has now instead continued is the cycle of racial hatred, specifically one Eldians promulgated themselves and now one they sustain. This is the cycle that Zeke, Karl Fritz, Eren, and all those other radicals had cast their eyes on. Zeke and Karl Fritz believed this could only be ended through Eldians quote-unquote submitting to the world's desires and destroying themselves. But Eren, however, refused to submit, and we will certainly get into this topic much more later. Never at any point do we see someone endorsing the idea that this plan will end human conflict. Not even Flock. But it will deal with the pertinent issue at hand, which is, well, the real relevant issue of the story, that is the hanging guillotine placed over every Eldian's head by the world. The other idea for the cycle is the cycle of Titans, that destroying paths would end this cycle. But, as previously mentioned, the Titans are not the inherent issue with this grand conflict. Paths and the power of the Titans are an issue when it comes to Ymir Fritz, the Titan powers being essentially weapons, and the curse shortening their lifespan. But this has little to do with the ideological dynamics of the conflict. It is even dealt with in an Eren and Armin conversation that the world sees them as devils, and there is nothing about this that can be changed, even if it is just a genetic characteristic of the ethno-cultural group. Onyankopon embraces their Titan abilities as exactly that, just as his people are known to have dark skin. So, what message does it send that the only way in which Mueller, the Marleyans, and the world as a whole only accept the Alliance and could only potentially make peace with the Eldians is once this trait is removed? The fact that this is established with the ending completely erases any sort of racial message you could have gleaned from the rest of the series. Forget Gabi's brainwashing. The reality set in by Peak, Eren, and the others that they are certainly subjects of Ymir, and should just accept this without bowing to the world over it. Apparently, we are now to believe that there was a logical reason for fearing the Eldians, and it is entirely rested on the unique trait of their race, just as Onyankopon could be quote-unquote logically feared for having dark skin. Because the racial message then becomes that paranoia of an outgroup for having a differentiating ethnic trait is rational, and that to avoid this, you must remove it. But then it later shows the Eldians being genocided anyways, for reasons elucidated earlier. The full Rumbling plan is not to kill everyone that is not your ethnic group, but a contextual destruction of the world which will also be explored later. To clarify, I honestly don't think this was intentional from Isayama, and neither do I think a lot wrong with this ending was. But this is the result and implications inherent to those results. I also do not think that the mass amounts of character assassinations were intentional either, as he clearly attempted and failed to link these together with his terrible ending. I think the best case for displaying this would be in the treatment of Historia. Now, Historia was one of my favourite characters, and I think Isayama had done a great job of crafting this very strong female lead. And I would go as far as to argue that she is like a female Eren, but even emotionally and mentally stronger. She had a lot of development in conjunction with Ymir in the Clash of the Titans arc and the Uprising arc, of which she was almost like the protagonist over Eren in. To me, she was much superior to Mikasa in character development, emotional strength, and narrative wit. Her character was akin to Eren in that she was centered around embracing the true self, necessarily rejecting the burden of the world and context she is placed in. We can see this in the underground scene where she rejects her father's idea to inherit the founding titan and quote-unquote save the world. In this, she symbolically quote-unquote leaves humanity to die by not embracing this role, which within the context would be sacrificing her true self to quote-unquote save the world. I don't think anyone saw this as selfish at the time, nor would anyone argue it to be. Historia is inarguably a central piece of the story of Attack on Titan, and does not lose this luster after the Uprising either, for there is a clear plot thread established in Historia's pregnancy. Her getting pregnant for the 50-year plan is established as a quote-unquote sacrifice so that they may preserve not only Paradis but quote-unquote the world. Sound familiar? Naturally, she accepts this idea as queen, but it is Eren who reminds her twice over that this is unacceptable. Not by goading her, but by appealing to her very self, and she embraces that. She also recognizes the true Eren, the enemy of humanity, who she made that promise to long ago. By the end, she has a child, and is shown to be happy, but there's something missing here. Something structural to her arc. Before this, she is shown unhappy while pregnant, and the issue of her pregnancy is very purposefully shrouded in mystery. First, our only account of it is given by a drunk MP who theorizes Yelena put her up to it specifically because he believes the purpose of her pregnancy was to save Zeke, unaware of the wine plan. But we know that this is not true because we later see that it was Eren who approached her on that day, telling her of his alternative rumbling plan. It is Historia in a flash forward in time who first brings up the idea of having a child. Historia takes charge and places the invitation onto Eren. This interaction here has been a subject of hot debate and really fueled the idea of Eren being the father, and for good reason. Eren being the father is the only conclusion that makes any sense, and would explain why we only hear half the conversation. But why couldn't it be the farmer? Well, we are never introduced to him as a real character, so if it really was just that he was the father and there was no mystery, we would have been given an actual introduction, no? It instead casts this entire situation as an ongoing mystery way past its relevance as merely being a potential part of Eren and Zeke's plan, all the way after the initial start of the rumbling, and Historia is even shown giving birth near the tail end of the series. Furthermore, the interaction between Eren and Historia has massive thematic relevance, since it is the continuation of the Uprising arc in their dynamic. Mikasa may have saved him physically many times, and he looked up to her in physical strength, but it was Historia who saved him mentally, emotionally. It was Historia who freed him from his slavery both literally and symbolically when Rod's will had overridden his own, and who he looked up to emotionally and mentally. She showed him the bravery of standing up to the quote-unquote greater good and to live freely. This is why it operates in conjunction with Carlos because he was born in this world line. The potential romance between them is well made because of this, as it is directly related to the central plotline. It is also the only way in which Historia's character stays consistent as to reach her end. Historia has no reason to get pregnant, for Zeke will already be protected with his wine plan, and Eren wasn't in any danger associated with Historia to begin with. Eren promised her that he would not sacrifice her, which is why he explains his alternate plan to the 50-year one. He retorts her appeal to their past actions by telling her that what he is going to do in the future for her future. It would be out of character both for Eren to 180 and be okay with sacrificing Historia when it would betray the significance of the underground scene and the uprising, and his intentions stated right in the conversation and in the War for Paradise arc. It would also be out of character for Historia to simply default back to being Krista, especially when Eren explicitly reminded her of all this in the same conversation, and become no different than her own mother by having a royal child according to a plan, rather than out of genuine love. It doesn't make any sense at all for this to even happen because there is no plan. Eren is telling her this because he's going forward with a different one. We are shown absolutely zero evidence of Historia loving this faceless farmer character, and it is not acceptable that Historia was written in this way, not just to bait the reader, but to make up an elaborate excuse to sideline her. Need I remind you that Eren's refusal to sacrifice Historia is the entire reason he took up on his plan with Zeke, and ran through that ringer. There is an incredibly special relationship going on here that had to be fulfilled somehow, but we instead see it sidelined because Isayama didn't want to play with it anymore, despite it being integral. I don't care about romance or shipping. Eren and Historia don't have to be romantic, but Isayama wrote these scenes. He crafted the context of the situation so that this is the only answer. Not just in literal plot, but thematic relevance. Then it went unanswered and unfulfilled. You can't just center your characters around their refusal to continue a cycle both on an individual and greater narrative level, and then end with a cycle continuing on both ends. It breaks the established characters and story. Some may use the last panel of her smiling with her child and being married to the farmer as proof that her character arc was concluded, and that she did love this nameless character. They might bring up how it plays into the themes of being not special. The farmer isn't special and neither is the child. But this is a vague downplaying of what that really meant. The farmer being nameless and faceless isn't some deep meta-commentary on not being special, and an ending in which Historia's child is Ymir reborn, or any theory similar to this wouldn't make them quote-unquote special either. Quite the opposite, they would get to live out a normal life while making that entire arc matter for an actually satisfying climax. Historia's arc concluding with being content with a family makes sense, but what makes it anticlimactic is that the situation we find ourselves with doesn't make sense and is missing an integral transition towards this phase. Imagine you were to draw a figure. You get the legs, waist, torso and arms done. And then you draw out the head, but it's missing something there. The neck that connects the head, and the head itself is just a shape, a mere outline. We know from the physique of the body that this is indeed a human body and that a head is supposed to go here, so we can infer that this is indeed supposed to be a head from its physique. And that makes sense because human bodies are supposed to have heads. Yet it is only the formless shape of a head, and it is still missing that neck. Without a neck, a person isn't even going to be able to live, and there will just be a body and a head separately. And this is exactly what we end up with Attack on Titan's characters. We know how the characters should logically end. We see a facsimile of this in the finale, but it's lacking very basic necessities which keeps it from feeling satisfying and makes it prone to varying interpretations and confusion from the audience. Take a look at Chapter 139 Eren. He has all the recognizable features of the Eren we all know. He looks like Eren, he has Eren's powers, he talks like Eren has, but at the same time, there is a clear disconnect. Well, what could this disconnect be? Surely you would not mean to dishonor Isayama's great vision by claiming that Eren's character was retconned, would you? Actually, not quite. And that's actually the inherent problem for the ending itself, in that Eren's character wasn't fundamentally changed or elucidated upon. In fact, the ending doesn't really introduce anything new to Eren's character besides his supposed love for Mikasa, which will be a future point when I discuss that mess. We have an alliance ending, yet we also have it where Eren is to be quote-unquote redeemed for his compatriots, and at the same time, still retaining his previous motivations. The problem is that these two things are mutually exclusive, which is the main reason Eren's depiction has been so divisive and hard to grasp. In general, Eren has been exactly that, and I will get into an extensive analysis here to tackle this very topic. boy who seeks freedom. Our protagonist that developed from a firebrand young kid out for revenge to an adult with a mission. Still seething with the same rage as before, but directed, controlled, towards the true target, which hadn't been the Titans all along. As it's been said, the Titan powers were only an element and not a direct problem outside of the Titan curse. We can see that Eren's hatred towards the Titans is soothed upon learning the truth of the basement, and he instead greets them as his quote-unquote fellow patriots. In his later travels, he too learns that the outside world is the same as Paradise. His enemies are no longer mindless, nor are they all willful mass murderers. Even the suffering and trials of warriors like Reiner becomes relevant and mirrors Eren's own tribulations. So who is the real enemy? What else but the world? The narrative up to the point even before the Marley arc had hammered this idea home, that it was them. That being the aliens against the world. But what is the world? Simply Marley and the other associated nations which all hate the aliens? No. There was a symbolic turn to this that had the widest reaching narrative implications. The world of Attack on Titan constantly oppresses its characters with the idea that they should have never been born. That it is better to die listlessly and peacefully. Historia's own backstory is rife with this trait, leading to her own sympathy that results in her rescuing Eren along with her love for children. This is the will of the world, as proclaimed by Sergeant Gross, Frieda under the will of Karl Fritz, and recognized by Eren as the simplest and easiest solution. Indeed, with the weight bearing down on Paradise even from their own race, it surely looks that way. Zeke, Reiner, Karl Fritz, and even Armin at times embrace the idea that they should have never lived. They give way to this unrelenting world feeling at the expense of themselves. This nihilistic constant, this will unto death, projected back onto the island and its inhabitants since the very start of the series, represented in the world, is the true enemy. This repugnant state of affairs is the genuine source of rage for Eren, and we see this as an act of passion in chapter 121, when Eren confronts Frieda under the will of peace. She preaches of this death drive and is responded to with the raw primal wrath of Eren. The shine of the founding titan in his eyes make him look like a man possessed by his own will. And this will to life is artfully demonstrated in his oft-repeated line inherited from his mother, "Because I was born into this world." This is not simply a will to live, because it is not simply about being alive, but about being born. This is exactly why the idea of children was persistently displayed, from Carla saying this phrase to a baby Eren, Ymir in her child form, Zeke's plan to sterilize the Eldians, Historia's backstory and own child, on Yankapon's efforts for Paradise under the Volunteers, Sasha's family, and is put forth as the representation of future itself.
みんなは平和に暮らせるんだぞ。
一生壁の中から出られなくても飯食って寝てりゃ生きていけるよ。でもそれじゃまるで家畜じゃないか。
ヒストリア。
壁を破壊し蹂躙された挙句家畜みてえに子供を産まされ殺されてやっと生きることが許されるっていうのなら、俺はジーク・イエーガーの計画は到底受け入れられません。地ならしの維持に我々の命運を委ねるのは危険です。残された時間の限りあらゆる選択を模索するのが我々の取るべき最善策ではないでしょうか。
Even many of our characters' core components that constitute their personal drives can be found in their childhood origin, with Mikasa to Eren, Eren himself to the breaking of the walls, Armin to his memories, Erwin with his father, Levi to Kenny, Reiner becoming a warrior, Historia and her family, Grisha going beyond the walls, Frankel Ymir becoming a false goddess, and Kruger with the field uprising. This battle of the wills, the literal fight between life and death, is the true core of Attack on Titan. Frida, enslaved by the will of Karl Fritz, who curses all future inheritors to pacification and abandonment of the future, against Eren, driven by his own will, which is able to influence and steer 2,000 years of the previous Attack Titan inheritors to himself, all to fight for the future. The fact that Eren is our protagonist, that we are delivered to this outcome, even should it come through manipulating his own father, shows the series as supremely anti-nihilistic. It was never any coincidence that Titans regenerate depending on a user's will to live. It is not simply about saving Paradis or his own childhood desire for freedom, but because all that denies life and subsequently gets in the way of freedom is an illegitimate reality. All of these previous desires are the product of this dichotomy, granted from Eren's inner nature. There was something Eren felt had been taken from him. And it wasn't truly on that day, though this event was the biggest spark for this feeling, but rather from birth. This is what he means when he says that he has been like this ever since he was born. The product of his birth had molded it this way, for the world itself with its all-encompassing smothering of life had been what truly birthed in Eren to destroy it altogether. He cannot allow any other ending, even when he attempts to rationalize the outcomes according to the conventional morality of the world. His rage seeps through, anticipating to burst at the seams. When we are born, all of us are free. People who reject that, no matter how strong they are, don't matter. This morality, this quote-unquote greater good, is an insult to life itself, an excuse for the world to oppress it again. Mikasa even likens Eren's first transformation to the physical manifestation of humanity's anger. His form in the Tross district holding that spherical boulder is the spitting image of Atlas, the Titan condemned to hold up the world, and the world responds by burdening him, crushing his body. But this only deepens his resolve at the cruel world, to instead prop up his own ideal of a world, a free world, the resolve to continue fighting, to keep moving forward. Now take a look at Eren's raw, concentrated indignation to death itself when Reiner tells him to sleep. That same shriek comes again. The anger of feeling that one has been forsaken by the world and all in it. Just hearing this one scream is enough to know that this is still the true Eren. The rage of life itself centralized in the one ravaging howl. Rewatch and reread all of his roars with this in mind. This recontextualization provided to us by his future developments, and you will feel the power of his world-aligning will in its clearest expressions. He even takes Reiner in this moment, his double, but one who submits unlike himself, and concentrates it as a reply to Reiner's capitulation. Look at the moralists who submit to the world's desires. Zeke, Karl Fritz, Willy Tybur. Indeed, Eren had moved beyond morality, for it had shown itself as worldly. Armin had once attempted to bridge the gaps in it, but was left with his own realization with Annie, choosing to embrace his acts as a personal mission rather than an altruistic heroism. And what is this birthright that had been so stolen from Eren, and which perturbed him so? That is, the unfettered life element where it is able to reign actual, in other words, the freedom entailed to life itself, which we first saw symbolized in Karl Fritz's walls. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Eren allows his will to carry itself towards this conclusion exactly because he refuses to be in chains. Even on a cosmic level, he breaks them. It is for this reason he is able to put forth both his friends and enemies alike in the dirt and reign over all. It was a god that had enslaved the people of Paradis with his own will unto death, and so Eren must become the devil to counter with his will to life, to offer the apple of knowledge. In a world where the weaker wills are enslaved, beaten, and forced to submission, even by their own selves, what other choice could there be for freedom to sprout? What other world but the one in Eren's ideal? This is not at all something that can be verbalized, but a feeling, an experience. Even in chapter 139, he cannot rationally explain it. But this piece of dialogue is contradictory because in the past, Eren would have never even tried. His roar being the closest one can carry this to meaning. This too comes to be the purpose for Eren specifically being the one that freed Ymir, as it represents the pinnacle of Fuchsian striving, meeting the almost literal eternal feminine. Ymir need not respond to Eren's query. She feels it in her heart already. That inner scream unable to escape through a mouth with no tongue. That same emotion lying deep down clouded by her own slave mindset. The blood that courses through a titan, the flesh that makes up its body, is this not life itself crafted through the deep-seated yearning for freedom in Ymir Fritz? Oh, but clearly Eren is a slave to his will? Or his idea of freedom? Or to fate? Or to decisions? This entire point has always been a point of contention, and much is to do with people's bizarre conceptions of freedom, which they only selectively dole out. Even now, I do not believe that the point is that Eren is a slave, and frankly, I've gotten pretty weary of seeing that Kenny quote tirelessly repeated. The quote, "everyone was a slave to something" line was spoken by a power-hungry serial killer who had to project his own feelings onto everyone as to debase their own drives and motivations. His philosophy here is allied with Zeke, another person who projects his insecurities onto an entire people, and seeing will as that which enslaves a person, developing a will unto death. Eren had triumphed over Zeke's ideals and overridden his plan, with Armin also talking Zeke down. If the series were subscribing to the Schopenhauerian pessimism, then the ending would reflect that, but it doesn't. Oh, but by the end, Eren is a pathetic loser. How could he be free here? He had no free will because of fate. In chapter 130, he outright states that this happened because he wanted it to happen. It was set in stone because this is who he is. He guided himself to Ymir. This sort of argument also misses the point of one particular interaction that states it as clearly as possible. In Eren's talk with Falco, there are two interpretations. One is that he doesn't believe free will exists, but that freedom does exist. It is something beyond that hell. He says it outright. What is pushing someone on that path, towards that hell, is not our free will, but our environment, the world. This same world has taken away people's freedoms, which is compulsory to their sense of self, which they have also lost. They are all pushed on this hard-fought path, the land of suffering. They must move forward to see what is on the other side of this hell, the edge of the world. Eren is talking of his future rule to shoulder all the evils of humanity, which is not a new concept, and indeed we see this same character arc in the famous Car Ansible, a similarly badass protagonist who radicalizes across a series of racial conflict. The other interpretation is the same as this, but that Eren does believe that free will exists, but that it is only found in following one's fate. This is the angle of a stoic, wherein free will is like being tied to the back of a wagon, which is fate. You can simply let it drag you across the dirt, or you can stand up and run with it. And this is your free will. In this, Eren chooses to run with it, to see where it will take him. Personally, the first interpretation makes the most sense to me, and explains better why he takes such prioritization in that scenery. The idea that Eren is a slave to himself, or to the future, which is also a slavery to himself, is, to be quite frank, an annoying point. The idea that he had become a slave to his own future, that he inscribed himself, just doesn't make any sense. Especially when he essentially resolves to follow the path that leads him to this future in the first place. It requires him to have originally made the decision to come to this future to begin with, and that his will for freedom was already strong enough as to manipulate time and space itself. Certainly, Eren in chapter 121 does not look like he cares for this responsibility, because he has long trounced it. He ends the paradox then and there. He is resolute in his freedom. This is also why it is obvious that Eren is lying within the table scene, because he states that it is all coming together out of his own free will, which he had previously denied existing. Instead, he is questioning Armin and Mikasa's conceptions of free will, and their conception of himself. He is confronting Armin on his own grounds, and challenging Mikasa's false perceptions of him born from that moment in time when he saved her. He points towards this point and time specifically so as to induce her to realign her outlook, and questions Armin's uselessness and refusal to take action when the situation begets it. When the time comes, Armin will have to decide whether or not to try and strike Eren down, and diplomacy won't help him there. It never helped him before. Not against Annie, Bertolt, or anyone. They had all been caught adamant. You can't reason. You can't talk it out with the world. You can only lash out. Strike some of your own self deep into it. The truth within the lies. But what of chapter 139? Well, it still does not contradict this fact, but that it is attempting to show that true freedom is transient, lonely, and arduous. Eren had apparently achieved the freedom he had wanted and hard-coded into his very being, and was left with nothing else by this point. The problem is that his freedom built up to this point never just ended at gazing at some particular sight, but in emulating the destructive dance of the will of a Shiva. At first, Eren simply wanted to see the outside world, the imagery of his freedom, but the outside world did not reflect that, so he must impress his ideal of the world over it. Young Eren here only sees a glimpse of what is to come. He doesn't see the actual world ideal come to fruition. Even Eren now keeps his eyes closed. He hasn't seen what's beyond that hell yet, because that hell still exists. The old world is still living on and continues after his death, reaping its due. Are we really to believe that Eren had come all this way just for a peek at Doomsday, and then afterwards slept until everything was over? We are even to believe with this now purely selfish intention that we are also to see him as a sort of tragic hero, or martyr, which is honestly laughable. We were teased about a broader part of Eren's intentions. Zeke points out that Eren had been manipulating his stream of information to their father, and showed Grisha something. Not only the rumbling in the underground scene, but something else that convinced Grisha to give Eren the Titans. That scenery. But now that scenery is merely this one moment in which Eren enjoys a brief springtime of what could be a scrap of his desires, as he tramples billions. This was what Grisha originally had seen, but not what could have convinced him to give Eren the Titans. And perhaps not what Eren is referring to in that scenery either. People have speculated that instead Grisha must have simply submitted to fate, or lost his mind after Carla was killed. But this is just pure assumption. We are not given any reason why Grisha fed himself to Eren. Simply brushing off character motivations and the like to a deterministic timeline where fate rules over all is lazy, uncreative writing that debases characters to robots, mindlessly doing tasks because of plot demands, for the convenience of the plot as well, and we are left with yet another plot hole. In chapter 139, we are immediately hit with two direct plot holes in just the first 2 pages. First, Eren states that his intentions with pushing his friends away were always to set them up as heroes of humanity, but he absolutely couldn't have known this from the start of his precognition. Why, you ask? Because he states the complete opposite in places where it doesn't otherwise add up. He tells Historia that the only choice is to bury all the outside world into the ground. Are we now to assume that he lied? But if we are also to assume that Historia's pregnancy really was just part of their plan, then why would Eren have uselessly wrapped Historia up in a lie? He had no reason to tell Historia about the plan, much less tell a huge lie to the person he owes the greatest debt towards. He certainly could not have known that this was going to be the outcome from the very start, because the main motivator for Eren's actions was due to him refusing to turn Historia into a Titan for her own safety. If he knew that the power of the Titans was going to be removed, then he literally had zero reason to be worried about this. Second, he also states contradictory within the goddamn chapter itself, that in the path he took towards this outcome, he dragged his friends into it without even knowing they would survive, and that his original intentions were likely that he would have really acted to destroy the world outside Paradise. So what stopped him? What caused the switch from that outcome to this one? If these were his original intentions, and he was being truthful before this random switch, then it isn't as if Eren had suddenly changed course of his own volition. So what was it? It was Ymir Fritz and her weaving of fate via path to see Mikasa decide to kill Eren. Let me translate this for you. It was the writer's decision to reduce the finale itself to the intercession of a deus ex machina, using the vagueness of this character to justify it. Eren was not stopped by himself nor by the Alliance, but by the plot. The only difference between Eren in Chapter 139 and the Eren before it is a matter of how he is handled by the plot. In order to deliver this finale, a piece of Eren had to be erased entirely. But when did Eren switch his motivations from full rumbling to the fated one where he saves his friends? If it wasn't at the time where he kisses Historia's hand, because I had previously explained how this makes no sense, then at one point, could it have been? I posit that the time that he changed that would make the most sense is when he activates the Founding Titan, but even this has its own plot holes. The underlying reason for why this is the case writing-wise is because Isayama had to handle Eren's character completely differently to deliver this conclusion, but I'll get into this more later. The only way in which Eren could see into the future is when he is able to receive messages using the Founding Titan's powers, which can only be brought out by those with royal blood. The only times in which this happens is when he touches Dina Fritz, Historia's hand, and Zeke. We may disregard the first for obvious reasons. Now, in kissing Historia's hand, we know that he could not have seen his entire future due to inconsistencies in his own monologues and motivations from that point to the rumbling. And Zeke even says that Eren could have not seen his entire future after a certain point. So the best time in which Eren could have seen this future is when he activates the Founding Titan using Zeke. There is a big plot hole here too, however, though there actually wouldn't have been if Eren's motivations never changed afterwards. When he kissed Historia's hand, he saw into the future because he saw a future version of himself with future memories in Grisha's point of view. However, at this time, Eren only showed Grisha certain memories, specifically of the rumbling, meaning past Eren himself only saw these specific memories. The whole lies in the fact that if Eren in the paths is aware of all future memories at this point, then why doesn't he have any notable change? He still states that he was born to be the guardian of freedom. He looks with wide eyes alongside Grisha at his younger self proclaiming he must continue as the not wasted lives of everyone before. He proclaims that his intentions are to destroy this world, and above all, shares the same conviction that he did when he was young. Perhaps it did not happen until after he freed Ymir, making it concrete that Isayama had to revise this entire portion for the later ending, something to be explored later. It was an early argument upon seeing this scene that when Eren says he's going to quote-unquote destroy the world, he's actually only referring to the world of paths. But this is ignoring the language prior to this. Zeke points out that Eren had prodded Grisha to fight against the king and the world itself. This most obviously not being the world of paths, and they are speaking of the same world. Which is why Zeke is so shocked and appealing to the future of it. Him saying all of this then leads to the activation of the rumbling. Even if it is part of Eren's idea to destroy paths in order to free Ymir, it works both ways in destroying both this world and the real one. He even states in chapter 139 that his original intentions were indeed always to destroy the outside world. If we are given all these details only for it to just mean destroying paths, then this means the writer has lied to us, since there is incomparably more evidence for it to mean one thing and little for it to mean the other, much less only the other. So the only possibility that remains is that Eren did not know the entirety of this future until he had fully activated the Founding Titan and its powers upon freeing Ymir Fritz. Meaning that Eren could have never known his future and changed his intentions until after chapter 122. Despite this, however, we are given little indication of his motivations changing from one to the next until much later. We are to assume that Eren chronologically from chapter 123 to 138 is just a facade, in spite of the fact that he is acting exactly the same to his original determination, making it still a lie on the writer's part. If this is the case, then the purpose of his flashbacks in chapter 130 and 131 are simply to trick the reader by showing even more of his original motivations. There has been much furor over the idea that Eren had been acting under a facade from the point where he kissed Historia's hand, certainly linked to the idea that he saw all of his future then and there. This is contradictory to his inner monologuing and his conversation and motivations regarding Historia as previously stated, along the selective set of memories that he inherited from Grisha. While it is true that if this is to be the case, then it's the only way to rationalize part of his demeanor, it also means that it wasn't Eren that was lying to everyone and to himself, but that it was the writer who lied to the reader. We did already know that Eren on Paradis, especially in the table scene, was at least half a lie, especially when the Ackerman bond is shown to be a fabrication on Eren's end. We also know that Eren truly does care for his friends, so this particular bit of violence onto them is out of character. The theme of that arc was, as Pixis states, mixing a bit of the truth into a lie, which fits perfectly well with the mystery of the story at that point. Eren obtained the Warhammer Titan, which is the Titan of Deceit, being previously held by the traitorous Tiber family. But we also know that part of what he says to Mikasa is not a lie, for Eren in chapter 139 does imply that he wants Mikasa to forget about him and live a happy life, which is what Mikasa realizes as his intentions with throwing away the scarf with her dream in the previous chapter. And he is just as able to say the opposite. It's an inner contradiction for his character. There are 3 other points I will explain before moving on to the Mikasa problem. 1. In that change from 122 to 139, it necessarily had to nerf Eren's will. And we see this materializing into the Founding Titan's ability in 139 being revealed as experiencing past and future all at the same time. This makes Eren lose his mind, and essentially his will, for the only way to deliver this into an EMA or Alliance ending by this point is to do so. Eren's will was too powerful. It had to be nerfed. It had to debase his will to simply a turn of fate, to which he is forced to become a plot device to deliver this end. We see this in his remuneration that he had to prevent the Smiling Titan from eating Bertolt and to redirect its course. Whether or not this is saying he directly caused his mother's death or indirectly matters little when it is the same conclusion anyways. But this wasn't enough. It had to directly deal with the issue of the birthright of Eren's will as well. So, we are delivered to the infamous quote-unquote, "I don't know, I just really wanted to" line. Obviously, it is pointing out that there is a reason, but that Eren just can't verbalize it or even feel it anymore. He speaks of it in past tense. Now, the Eren in the Paths chapters absolutely could feel this will imbuing him with an indescribable power, and was able to direct it cogently. And the reason he is no longer able to channel that is because of him losing his mind to the Founding Titan's time ability, which has its own plethora of problems. Essentially, the writer had to utilize the vagueness and mystery box element of Eren and the Titan abilities in order to force the plot to gimp Eren and his will, to separate him into a body and the outline of a head. Attack on Titan is a plot-driven series, and so when Eren became the primary driver of the plot upon the time skip, and especially in Paths, he became such an exciting character to the reader base. Naturally, any character in this position would become beloved, and when you place them into a situation where their actions are completely uncontested and unchallenged, even at the end, then it becomes a waste. Eren's driving of the plot is instead quote-unquote subverted by placing it in the hands of an elusive plot device character with a nonsensical motive. What we see in the last chapter is an Eren with his will removed, a shadow of his former self, for it is the will that is the crux of his character, the will that makes a man. He had always been characterized by his will, ergo attempting to define him without it, we come to a textbook character assassination. If this chapter contained the true Eren, the essential Eren, he may have fallen into a momentary depression, but would return soon after with a vengeance, like every other time. The biggest assassination here is in his decision to simply die, this basically being an act of suicide. Such an action is completely unlike Eren, and it undoes the magnitude of the underground scene with Historia. What do we see in this scene but a reminder that Eren's life will always be worth something, even if he is an enemy to humanity, and that he is an eternal devotee to this fact in Historia. Why does he state otherwise? That he could never be forgiven? He even reminded Historia, and the reader along with them, just 9 chapters ago of the importance of that moment. This entire scene, which was of such importance to both characters, now means nothing. He probably even could have transferred consciousness, but that mechanic apparently only existed now to give Reiner plot armor for the Shiganshina arc. Eren had never just been some whiny kid. From a young age he was already viciously mauling adults out of his own will, and cried tears that turned into rage upon losing his mother to the Titans. He was vengeful. Even in a Titan's belly, he was hanging on to the threads of his preservation. When presented with the idea that he had an enemy that was no mindless Titan, but a human, a compatriot nonetheless, in Annie, he hesitates significantly. But then he is reminded of his revenge, his inner drive, and lashes out, losing all control. As time goes on and he is faced with the same scene in Reiner and Bertolt and so on, he reacts quicker and quicker, until he fully integrates into the destruction of his target. He may always hesitate, but he eventually advances to the conclusion nonetheless. Even with Ramsey, he ends in moving forward. As one can see from all of this, the idea that Eren's intentions were only ever to save his friends is not only actively removing complexity from his character, but directly contradicted by his words in that last chapter, that he didn't even know if they would survive, and that his original motivations were always to destroy the world. Eren in the underground scene could be said to be quote-unquote whiny, but his dilemma fit perfectly for the situation. And this working in tandem with the scene between Shadis and Carla is possibly the most important point of development for Eren. Even more so now that it goes hand in hand with the resolution of Ymir Fritz, the most important character in all of the story on whom rests the climax itself, and with Eren as well. Mikasa's fate was always going to be tied with Eren's, and this is a given considering that Eren basically dictates each and every facet of Mikasa's character. Clearly, everything leading up to her resolution points to this no longer being the case, for her to simply move on, as repeatedly stated directly by text or by arc. We may even take one particular arc within the finale itself, that being Mikasa and Louise. Louise looks up to and idolizes Mikasa for having saved her as a child, and dedicates her life around this idol. This is the most obvious parallel to Mikasa and Eren you could possibly write, and in Louise we see how this obsessive idolization leads to nothing but self-destruction and inhibits development. Mikasa's character development is quite actually about attempting to overturn a limiter on her own character from the moment where she was saved by Eren. Mikasa and Eren do not enjoy a healthy relationship, and are incompatible. Even chapter 138 hammers this home by showing an unsatisfied Eren yielding to Mikasa's dream over his own. The reason she had been going back to that moment in the cabin when she was saved is because of her coming to terms with her false idol. Ever since that day, she had misunderstood him, and this comes to permeate their every interaction. It is often argued that the moment they have here at the end of the Clash of the Titans arc is proof of Eren and Mikasa all along. combined with the moment in chapter 123. But neither of these were actually romantic on Eren's side, and it would be very weird if they were. In the first, Eren is faced with his complete and utter inability to save anyone despite his growing strength. He becomes angry against himself. Mikasa admonishes this, and appeals to what he has already achieved. She is submitting, saying, quote, "We tried hard, the fight is over, let's rest." But Eren does not receive her kiss, because he does not submit to death. We have seen this scene before, when he is inside a Titan's stomach, and his hands still reach out to the sky. He has no reason to even consider that there is still a fight, and yet he rages on nonetheless. Reason cannot claim his heart, and neither can Mikasa's appeals. So, he retorts with what he will continue to do, going forward. In the second, we see Mikasa retroactively confronting her misunderstanding of Eren's intentions. She, at the time, misinterprets the scene to be Eren asking Mikasa a romantic question, but we know by this point that this is not the truth. It is for this important reason this immediately comes after Eren's precognition is revealed along with his rumbling plan. We know what Eren is actually talking about here, looking at what we later learn to be Ramsay's family. We get a hint of his suffering, and Mikasa wonders if things might have changed if she hadn't been so ignorant. Both on account of them ignoring Eren's ambitions all along, and in her own misinterpretation of Eren's character. If she had recognized who Eren truly was, would she have continued to feel obligated to protect him? To love him? She loves Eren out of obligation to a fake version of him. If she knew the real him, would she have loved him? And would she have been able to stop the yearning in his own heart? If looking back to his past actions at the cabin, which he highlighted as an outstanding of his own vicious inner self, is anything to go by, then the answer is clearly in the negative. It was all decided from the start, not by fate, but by their own selves. If I am instead to believe that Eren was watching Hans get eaten and everyone he knows in peril and was actually focused on Mikasa's kiss that will ensure his death, or that he had just gotten done crying and recounting his memories regarding Ramsay and the other people that he sees himself kill in the future, and he instead diverts his mind solely to whether or not Mikasa will still let him hit, then this entire series is a joke. By the end, she makes up her mind to recognize the true Eren, but loves him unconditionally nonetheless, even should she have to kill him. I think this is fine, but we do not see her moving on from him and establishing her own life. All we are treated to are snippets of her at Eren's grave from life to death. She apparently got over to Paradise by running across an entire continent and taking a swim across the sea too. One may defend this by saying we don't know if this is just an annual visit or otherwise, but that's exactly the point. We don't know. We only see her there. She could be living inside the tree itself for all we know, marrying her husband and conceiving their children right there. There's more evidence for this than there is that she does anything else at all. We don't see her at any other location ever. I had thought that if it was going to be an alliance ending, that we'd at least get to see her embracing her role as a princess of Historia or whatever, but this was also dropped entirely. Instead, we are apparently to be satisfied with this being her conclusion, and the entire story centering around this scarf, which is so strong because it is evidently made up of all those loose plot threads that this ending has created. The important bit here that I will now emphasize is that the story now centers all around the scarf. If you're not fulfilled by this fact, the ending means absolutely nothing for you thematically. Freedom? Abandoned 8 to 9 chapters ago. Clashing ideals between our cast? Oh, never there to begin with. Racial conflict? Genocide? Temporarily resolved just to save a couple of your favorite characters before it resumes after they're dead and gone anyways. Was your favorite character someone outside of the Alliance? Too bad, they're sidelined or a plot device now. We are supposed to feel the strength of an Ackerman bond without even knowing how the Ackermans work. And it really seems like they never worked for any other purpose than to deliver overpowered characters as a writing crutch. At the end, Mikasa's memories are altered, even though Ackermans are resilient against this, as stated as an absolute by Kenny's ancestor, We are also supposed to believe that the reason Mikasa had headaches was because Ymir Fritz was looking through her vision, even though Levi also had headaches as part of his Ackerman origins. We are now to believe that the never-to-be love between Eren and Mikasa, which was never healthy to begin with, is so powerful as to break a 2,000-year-old curse and save the world. Even though these two characters have never even had a one-on-one conversation or even any real development towards a romantic end. Mikasa's panels being the biggest in the memory shards is not a development. Foreshadowing is not a substitute for development. Foreshadowing only offers hints, and the hints do not create a good thread of plot here. Mikasa is able to pierce through this upon gathering the resolve to kill Eren, but with this, also remains resolute in loving Eren, now unconditionally. She loves Eren, ergo she must kill him. Obviously, this is to be the conclusion of her character, but with this ending, we are also to take this to be climactic on another level in freeing Ymir. Freeing Mikasa from love is the same as freeing Ymir, who must also be freed from love. But the situation of Ymir Fritz was completely different from Mikasa's, and thus this parallel makes no sense. In chapter 122, just before we get to Ymir Fritz's background, we are also shown a direct parallel between her and Historia. Historia was ensnared by the situation she found herself in, forced to take on a slave personality that bends over backwards to be generally acceptable to all people. Krista. We see Ymir too as a literal slave than a mental slave, for which her likeness is used to craft the personality of Krista. You could not get any more obvious in this parallel, not even to mention the many other similarities drawn. Historia's freedom is found in throwing off the contextual burdens and embracing the true self, the part that wishes to reign freely and unrepressed. We see this also occurring for Ymir Fritz. There was an inward yearning for that same freedom. Even in chapter 135, we see Ymir freeing the pigs with a light smile. Freeing Ymir goes hand in hand with freeing Historia. Mikasa, on the other hand, is about cutting through a personal attachment. It has little to do with a worldly state of affairs pressing down on her. Let us also be sure to highlight one clear fact. In chapter 139, Ymir loves King Fritz. In the original Japanese, it uses the strongest language possible for love, and the parallel is only completed to begin with if this is the case. The extra panels depicting Ymir Fritz imagining if she had let Karl Fritz die is her wishing she repeated the same action Mikasa did for Eren. This is why the two are interacting. She is not wishing she had transferred her love to her children. She is coveting the idea that she could have let King Fritz die that day in spite of her love. Much like Mikasa, she would have memorialized King Fritz with her children and continued to love him. We must accept this, otherwise the parallel within the chapter itself makes no sense. And thus, the ending is completely and utterly absurd even within a vacuum. Ymir Fritz was in love with the man that enslaved her, raped her, used her as a weapon for imperial ambition, mocked her own sacrifice, and then had their children eat her corpse to pass on her powers to continue his empire and legacy. It was not Stockholm Syndrome as is popularly argued, as if this isn't so obviously insulting to anyone that's ever been in an abusive relationship. Now, I don't know a single person in their right mind that is going to sit here and even attempt to defend this story point. It is absolutely revolting, insulting, and nonsensical. All of this even more so that Ymir Fritz and her 2,000 years of history are the ultimate thesis upon which everything in Attack on Titan lies. And the fact that Isayama specifically took the steering wheel out of the hands of Eren and placed it onto this entire controversy is laughable. It gets even worse remembering that she had already disobeyed her love to the king when she chose Eren over the royal blood Zeke, who even mirrors the original king in his panels. This is what the entire series was gambled on, and it was a complete loss. Ymir Fritz's dilemma is not even unique either. We don't know if there was a similar situation across 2,000 years that could serve the same end, but we do know of examples within the story itself that got across the same message. Early on, we have the fragile Ymir, named after the real Ymir nonetheless, and Historia, who must give up their love for each other for a greater purpose. Peculiarly, in the self-professed egoistic Ymir sacrificing herself so that Historia can live, and Historia must accept this to happen. We even see Grisha apologize for the abuse he put Zeke through, and affirm to Zeke that he does love him, with Zeke reciprocating that fatherly love in spite of his childhood torments. It's a statement of loving someone in spite of that prior abuse. Now, these two little arcs are already infinitely better than Ymir Fritz's whole arc, considering that we are never at any point made to think that she could possibly love such a man, nor that he loved her or was anything other than just a terrible person. Apparently, we are to look at her gazing at the king kissing a woman and wishing she was that woman being loved, and that she loved the king as a result, and that this love was completely valid and true. Absolutely absurd. I previously stated that the Founding Titan's ability to experience past and future at the same time was introduced at random for the sole sake of gimping Eren's will. We may figure this from the contrast between paths in 121 and this feature within the last chapter. The reach of the Founding Titan that we are given in the path chapters of 120 and 122 is much more limited and a lot better overall. Eren manipulates Grisha specifically in this moment because the Attack Titan combined with the Founding Titan's powers is still limited to his own direct past inheritors. We had no reason to presume it could transcend all of space and time, and it isn't even until the last chapter that we even see that this is possible. And no, a small, vague panel in a previous chapter does not make this a fair development. The fact that Eren mentions this bit about his responsibility in the Dina Fritz Titan killing his mother, and it's just immediately brushed off despite the absolute magnitude such a reveal takes on, is astonishingly terrible writing. This only makes one beg the question that, why hadn't anyone used the Founding Titan for this purpose before? To manipulate the past? I guess the answer would be because fates, aka plot convenience, wouldn't it? The most important note to make regarding the build-up and this ending is that, as previously stated, foreshadowing is not a substitute for development. The series had prided itself on its great plot twists that to a certain extent could be reasonably predicted. The big basement reveal provided a great feeling of catharsis, satisfaction, and even then still felt like one very large piece to an even larger puzzle. We could predict a larger world outside of their own, that there was some sort of racial conflict linked to the Titans, the family connection between Eren, Zeke, and possibly even the Smiling Titan, and that this bigger world was more advanced than their own, among many other factors. You could never foretell the complete picture, but one is able to create a good idea of what the outcome is to look like. They are left with many answers and new questions alike. The build-up of the connection between Eren and Ymir immediately makes sense as soon as it falls into place. The message Eren receives and transmits, responding to the cry for freedom no one else can hear in Ymir Fritz, is foreshadowed from the first chapter. To you, 2,000 years from now. From you, 2,000 years ago. The developments of the royal family, origination of paths and the founder, all led up to this event story-wise, specifically targeting Eren from its very first hint and never leaving him in its importance. For only the man who fights for freedom could possibly reach Ymir, not because she fated it to happen, but because he, out of all shifters, actually cared to listen to her. If we try to chalk it up to Ymir fating things to happen, then we run into all sorts of plot holes, such as it meaning she had already disobeyed her love to the king by fating this eventually, which can't be possible, and also why she would even need to do all this if she'd see it happen anyways. A quote-unquote deterministic timeline is just a bad writing excuse for this egregious plot hole on the most important plot element of the entire story. But then, the last minute twist is that it is actually that all of that build-up was just so that Eren could pass it on to Mikasa right afterwards, whose only connection to Ymir Fritz in plot elements is the randomly introduced headache problem at the end, which is in itself a plot hole as explained earlier with its Ackerman connection. Immediately after the rumbling pops off, the Survey Corps realize a certain extent of Eren's plan. That he has activated this of his own desire to protect the island and them, his dear friends. Jean, above all else, acknowledges this through his experiences with Floch and his own cool-headed rationalizations, and subsequently undergoes a dilemma. Eren has gifted them all the ability to live out long lives, and all they have to do is let him move forward. Jean wavers between being content within the Jaeger's camp, or feeding his moral half and risking it all in joining the Alliance. This little arc of development alone constitutes the moral plight of the Alliance as a whole, and the fact that it is so little felt beyond a couple characters was always an itchy feeling to Alliance's chapters. However, we do know that the Alliance had quickly been aware that Eren was doing it for his friends, and they did not want him to do it on their behalf. They pleaded with their friend to stop, for they would not rest easy knowing such atrocities were committed for their lives, and should he stop, they promised to share his guilt, accepting that they had partially driven him to this point. So, what do you think the ending does with this? Well, of course, they sing the high praises for Eren saving them, having genocided most of the outside world for this outcome. Eren goes from the villain of humanity to a sacrificial martyr, and the audience too must weep at his Christhood, for he has now saved your favourite characters. The genocide is swept to the side for this purpose, and was also the only way to deliver this conclusion of the audience's favourite characters surviving. And what's worst is the audience is expected to be thankful and ignore, no, even be grateful that Eren did this mass genocide for the sake of those few lives we are most intimate with. Now, I am aware that Armin's infamous lines there are not intended to be a direct thanking of Eren for the genocide itself, but trying to alleviate the burden on his good friend. But, like, come on. There are a bunch of different ways to put this, and even if we take the best possible interpretation of these lines, how are we to explain the rest of the Alliance all eulogizing his great oblation for their sake? No amount of small translation changes can account for the tone being so obviously set here. I had actually predicted that this would end up being the case, that an Alliance ending would ironically end up being the most quote-unquote pro-genocide ending, and I had achieved scarily accurate results. Isayama might have wanted to phrase Eren's actions as this unforgivable evil and that he is a selfish villain, yet he also wants him to be a martyr for his friends in order to redeem him to the general audience. How are we supposed to feel satisfied for the conclusion of his battle of clashing ideals when Isayama provides zero alternatives to the mass genocide? The only plans we are left with here are Zeke's plan, which is a self-inflicted mass genocide, and Eren's plan, which is the inverse of Zeke's. Never at any point does he even attempt to show the case otherwise, and with the extra panels, he goes as far as to retroactively hammer this point in. Let me also remind you that the 50-year plan was not even a real plan. It was a plan born out of Zeke managing the Court Kiyomi's correspondence. Zeke, of course, had no intention of ever following this plan, and merely used Hisaru's established trading relationship to obtain the necessary provisions for his own plan. Hisaru's only interest was in leeching off resources, particularly the Iceburst Stones. They had not permitted Eldia to bridge a trading relationship with other powers due to them wanting monopolization of these resources, and any attempt we see of improving the position of Eldians on the continent only comes at the disadvantage of the Paradisians. Essentially, this plan is Eldia entrusting much of its fate to one nation whose only interest is resource dependent, and the relationship itself is very rocky and could easily fall apart as soon as the resource is no longer viable. Hanji herself questions the morality of this plan due to it requiring the sacrifice of Historia, repeating the same cycle that they had promised to end. The Alliance had little regard for this plan. It was simply a default, and after the rumbling starts, the plan is long abandoned. Forsooth, the Alliance had no plan. Ever. The dialect between Hanji and Jean even elucidates on this fact. They are civil servants, with the job of protecting the island and its people, and also the principle of protecting humanity itself. Yet, at no point can they guarantee either. It is exactly for this reason they become quick fodder to the Jaegerist uprising and draw their ire as well. Hanji and Jean are great examples of the best Alliance members. They both face a core dilemma in their desires, precision, and morality in different ways. Jean is able to grasp the harsh reality because it constantly bothers him and his inner prospects for a quiet life. He recognizes his weaknesses. Hanji may have no plan, and recognizes this as her own helplessness and a failing in her ability to command. But she also knows her desires, her morality. She is constantly assaulted by the large responsibility weighing on her shoulders, and she jumps at the chance to give her heart in a final fight against the Titans, as if partially out of her desire to escape. In this way, she acts as the perfect leader of the Alliance, and once she is out of the picture and the torch is passed to Armin, is when the Alliance becomes fully flat. Armin is an unfortunate case of a failed character when the ending depends on the strength of EMA. Even more unfortunate is that by this point in the story, EMA had long become superseded by infinitely more interesting dynamics and characters. Eren's relationship with Zeke, Reiner, and Historia alone held much more potential and depth than EMA did. I looked into Mikasa earlier, and her arc is a relatively simple one that is done a disservice and does a disservice to all others by lifting it up as the crowning achievement of the story. We are apparently supposed to be satisfied with an EMA ending, even though Eren had barely had any interaction with either of them after the time skip, most being the table scene itself. The flashback sequences do not offer much for this development either, besides to highlight the growing distance between Eren and the others, having ignored the true Eren lying before them. With all this build-up in clashing ideology with the flashbacks and a continuation in real time of the fight itself into the finale, you'd reasonably expect it to be a clash of the wills between Eren and Armin. These two characters have differing conceptions of freedom, separate priorities, and distant ideals. But this is not what we get. Instead, Eren exists to serve Armin and the Alliance a victory on a silver platter and have no particular ideals of his own. Instead giving up to Armin because the plot demanded it. I had actually long defended Armin, for I saw in him future potential for his character, whereas Erwin's was finished on the roof. Although the dynamic between Armin and Eren in ideology was not as interesting as Eren's with Zeke or Reiner, it had its own merits, and the long-standing friendship between the two certainly played into that. However, this potential is squandered for the same reason that Eren became a wasted character. The plot demanded him to play a specific part to deliver this ending. Now, Armin was facing a similar dilemma to Hanji. A responsibility was placed on his shoulders by his own friend, of whom he constantly had to question and challenge his ideas of in the process. This burden was pushing him to the brink. He even lashes out on Mikasa in a heated debacle and immediately regrets it, lamenting that Erwin was chosen over him. This choice still sits in the back of his mind. He even brings it up in the airship with Hanji, stating his wish that a piece of Erwin could stay with him to weather the storm approaching. Armin was heading for this quote-unquote make or break moment, similar to the Shiganshina arc where he is suddenly placed into provisional command. Armin's eventual determination and plan which resulted in his sacrifice was undoubtedly the peak of his character, and it seemed that he was heading for a similar position, but with incomparably more lives on the line in the process. Personally, I thought Jean should have become the commander of the Survey Corps. It would be more fitting with him as representation of the polarity of the Alliance being between the Corps and the Warriors, along with the interaction he had with Hanji given more significance. He is also a natural-born leader over Armin, who is prone to shyness and indecisiveness. At the very least, I think it would have been best if they had shared command. Either way, the transfer of the Survey Corps commander is alone a heavy burden, even more severe in this position after the undoing of Hanji. But at no particular point does it feel like Armin is pressed in the same way. In fact, in the early stages of the battle, we see Levi act as the commander while Armin does little of note. The closest we get to this is chapter 136 to 137, where this is immediately and easily resolved with plot convenience and the power of friendship, which immediately turns the battle around while he suffers no repercussions for anything. The only actual dilemma the Alliance is faced with is whether or not they should kill Eren, and they don't even make up their mind until they are about to do it. If I were to assume that Armin's philosophy, which reads like a Zombieland quote, is the quote-unquote true theme of the series, then maybe he should have crafted a situation befitting this. Instead, this philosophy just leads to a terrible ending for Paradis and makes sacrifice for naught. That we shouldn't even focus on this genocidal conflict and just enjoy the small beauties is such a privileged ideal that it could even be considered offensive. If you can't fight, you can't win. This is an accurate quote, because for Paradisian Eldians, just to live every day, every second, is a fight in itself. Eren did not abandon the beauty in this world. His hugging Ymir Fritz was a perfect encapsulation of the theme of the quote-unquote cruel but beautiful, in which Eren orders the world to doom, but unlocks the freedom of another person to delight in as well, all by his own hand. The Alliance is entirely reactive, thus making them narratively inferior to Eren and even the Jaegerists. They have no clearly defined goal or even a smidgen of a plan. They simply want the rumbling to stop and for Eren to come back. They are postured as quote-unquote world saviors constantly when they have no actual plan for what comes after the end of the rumbling, and attempt to just sidestep this issue by saying they quote-unquote have trust, which makes no sense in such a situation. When chapter 126 ends with that almost parodical panel, the next chapter that hits us with Yelena pointing out all their contradictions and fallacies, which leads to this altercation between Jean and Reiner. They may talk now and wish they had always talked, but they also recognize that what is done and can't be taken back, and thus, Jean still can't forgive Reiner. The Alliance peaked here, for it showed it as not a band of merry friends that they are uncharacteristically depicted as at the end, but a loose alliance with mixed goals and bad grudges. Yelena may have not driven them apart, but it certainly showed the hard limitations between individual members. The reason the Jaegerists rise up and take over is realistic is because they respond to the pure indecisiveness of the Survey Corps, along with the useless power the government holds onto, and thus have faith and popular support. The battle between the Alliance and the Jaegerists is, for the most part, quite good. It is great in portraying the desperation and helplessness of the Jaegerists and how central this is to their movement. The Alliance's battle with them is not to show them as pathetic, but a moral feeling of the Alliance in their mission. Connie weeps when he is forced to kill Daz and Samuel in a sudden betrayal. The worst part is that they know they have no way to calm the Jaegerists, just as they had no way to prevent them from coming about either. It is at the same time a reminder of their own helplessness mentally, despite their combative strength. In spite of all of this, we're apparently supposed to believe the Alliance is ideologically equal to Eren in their battle, even though they have no actual ideology, and just want there to be no genocide, offering no substitute. Isayama apparently wanted the Alliance to indeed be seen as the good guys having to make bad choices, but never narratively provided an alternative to mass genocide even up to the last panels. The Alliance are strong soldiers and titan shifters in the privileged position to be able to choose what they want to do regarding the world and the rumbling. No one else has this freedom, ergo, everyone else is a Jaegerist. The fact that they gamble and lose makes this conflict, quite frankly, black and white to their narrative disadvantage. If you think that the point of Floch's character, the darker side of common man, is to be a pathetic loser and little else, then why is he proven to be completely and utterly correct? We even get a situation where the entire island is narratively sacrificed for everyone's favorite bunch of characters, mirroring Floch's powerful speech at the funeral, deriding the choice of Armin over the more rational choice that would benefit the common masses, such as himself, who can't enjoy the privilege of being a powerful titan shifter or having Ackerman hacks. Isayama wrote a character that attacks the main cast for all of this, then proceeds to write an ending where all of the worst possible fears displayed here by the Jaegerists come to complete fruition so that the main cast of everyone's favorite characters can live, all while singing the hymns to Armin's greatness. Floch ended up being correct even against the writer himself.
お前がアルミンの何を知ってるって言うんだ。言ってみろよ。知らないな。俺は幼馴染じゃないし、仲良しでもないから。でもなんでアルミンが選ばれたかはわかる。お前ら二人とリヴァイ兵長が市場に流され、 注射薬を私物化し、合理性に欠ける判断を下したからだ。要は、大事なものを捨てることができなかったからだろう。何の勲章だ？誰を弔う？これから補充する調査兵団には本当のことを言えよ。俺みてえな腰抜けが間違って入ってこねえようにな。エルヴィン団長なしでこれからどうするつもりなんだよ。そりゃ俺みてえな雑魚使い捨てるぐらいしか使い道もねえだろうが、そんな雑魚にだってな、値踏みする権利くらいはあるだろう。
Annie returns and joins the Alliance in a comedic fashion, and with no animosity from anyone. I am not saying Annie deserves to die for her admittedly sadistic treatment of the Survey Corps members or her atrocities, but the fact that all we see in any sort of lingering feelings which are bound to exist is in some sort of brief interaction between her and Mikasa, specifically on the Eren question, and between Jean and Reiner feels incredibly unrealistic. You'd at the very least expect Mikasa, and especially Levi, to naturally have some friction considering the impact Annie had on them. Her destruction of Levi's squad and Petra was an early display of Levi's internal suffering. They should have at least minimally have some choice words for each other that has the possibility of spilling over into conflict and needs to be mediated by Hanji or the others. And in general, this should be a more common event. The Alliance is not a congruous unit, and the fact that this is not explored more in their battles is a completely wasted opportunity. Falco being able to transform into a bird beast titan and see extremely distant memories of this titan upon drinking a single drop of Zeke's spinal fluid is beyond a stretch and is just pure plot convenience. The fact that he is not only able to do this, but also control it perfectly a couple of chapters after going berserk and also his first transformation as the Jaw Titan, and about half an hour after Hanji just died because they had no way to protect the plane, is such an absurd point and breaks the very foundation of the Titan powers. Making Eren a pseudo-Lelouch who was actually planning to lose and die as a villain all along also removes any weight there was to the final fight because the Alliance was always going to win anyways. Though it's not like there was much to begin with because no one even dies, barely anyone gets injured, only Levi's leg. Jean, Connie, and Gabby get cop-out deaths which were reverted in a single chapter. The past Titans are all also fan service and go down easily. The Alliance apparently had infinite supplies of gas and blades on them, despite this being a constant throughout the series, and infinite energy within them as well. If they didn't have all this plot magic, they would have never been able to stand a single chance against Eren to begin with, and the lengths the writing goes to stretch this actually breaks the story, which was so good at carrying that pressure and weight within the battles before. The scenes of the Survey Corps seeing Sasha in the clouds and Levi saluting to his legacy are honestly embarrassing, especially in tandem with the extra panels that show the destruction of Paradis. Isayama also apparently forgot the huge significance of Marco and Jean since he literally just doesn't appear. They achieved absolutely nothing. They didn't create 100 years of peace. They simply extended Paradis' livelihood of fear and paranoia of being annihilated before eventually happened once and for all.
いつまで生きてられっかな。
とりあえずは生き延びたじゃないですか。
とりあえずはな。
よかったじゃないですか。生きてるんですから。
死んだ奴らの遺体に向かってそう言えるか。
The idea that Eren did it only for his friends and that he would never get his friends killed for his dream or a future free world is quite an enslaving idea, isn't it? Note the language he uses, always saying I want them to live happy long lives. And this particular instance in chapter 130 finds itself juxtaposed to his reaction to Sasha's death and his interaction with Ramsey, both on whom died because of his own actions to utilize Zeke also shown. Apparently, Eren would never get his friends killed, but also didn't know if they would even survive. And I guess Sasha, Hanji, and Floch just kind of fell out of that circle. And yes, before you inquire, Flock is shown in a panel afterwards as a picture of his friends. In the time skip and the Marley arc, Reiner reigns as certainly the most interesting character, as we see this new world through his lens. We had viewed him solely as an enemy, and now viewing the harsh truth of our own eyes, it added a new layer to the conflict we had just become fully aware of. Eren states it directly, that Reiner is just like him, but there is a key difference which I elucidated earlier. Reiner submits. He kneels. Attempts to become the scapegoat of Eren's rage to concentrate on, rather than the world. But he is out of his depth. Eren has moved past Reiner and recognizes him and many others as just another victim of this world, even if they did help to perpetrate its evils. Reiner was ensnared by the Helos principle. He had wanted to be a hero only to realize how shallow this really was. Eren had liked to view himself as the hope of humanity that Eren and the Survey Corps hyped him up as, but both were wrong. Attack on Titan takes multiple angles on the hollowness of the hero figure. Helos was a false idol, and the image of a hero emulates this, from Eren to the Survey Corps, to Eren to Mikasa, and many other examples. Once Reiner had realized this sad truth, alongside the truth of the Eldians that had previously comprised who he was, riding on the expectations of his family, he broke down. Like Flock in Shiganshina, he realized the falsity of the propaganda as he was speeding towards a meaningless death. And it is this moment that changes a soldier forever. But it wasn't his fault. He could never do anything about this product of his birth. Eren affirms this to him, and where Reiner falls, Eren rises. The only way in which Reiner finds to repent for his atrocities is by affirming death. But that's the inherent problem. It is a self-destructive drive towards death whereby one stagnates. In the end, Reiner continues to simply fulfill the expectations that enslaved him. He is a shadow of Eren. The man who keeps moving forward meets the man who stands by. They are both necessarily born from the same origin. It is for these reasons that I had always been against the hypothetical Helos ending for Reiner, in which he saves the world by defeating Eren or something akin to this, either through sacrifice or otherwise. It may satisfy Reiner's arc on an individual level, but it does not integrate with the larger themes. In fact, it betrays them. Across the series, Reiner projects himself onto Eren, particularly in trying to see his will unto death in Eren, when it is not there. The scene in chapter 117, as it was mentioned earlier, being the best example of this dynamic. Reiner even most obviously projects himself onto Eren in chapter 133. The language used is, quote, "if I was in his position," rather than appealing to Eren's true nature. The actual ending we get with Reiner just brushes aside his entire arc. He hugs his mother and it's all gone away in an instant, despite his problems going well beyond his mother's expectations. It was the expectations of his entire world. If Reiner is to end contently, he must battle his inner death drive. But instead, he just wrestles with a worm. Reiner being concluded by sniffing a letter is completely nonsensical, and accepting this just because it shows him happy is on the same level. Not only has the entire Jean plus Reiner scene been forgotten, but apparently Reiner's dilemma has as well. Even when he speaks of saving the world from Eren, he doesn't put himself on a retrial. He places all of his hopes and future onto Falco just as he did before. If we are to get a content Reiner ending, then it should be shown individually, as in he's developed a moderate will to life in spite of his past, rather than disregarding it altogether. The atrocities Reiner was forced to take part in and the mental toll of the Paradise operation have little to do with his mother directly. Body, no neck, and outline of a head.
The interviews within the guidebook actually leaked when most of the original script was written, yet not a single thing was needing revision even when they came out in full. In fact, they empowered my thoughts even more. The popular idea that whiny Eren is the true Eren constitutes a weakness in readers' comprehension rather than any actual insight into the creator's intentions. Such an argument is simply born out of the will to create a gotcha against detractors, not even for the series itself, but for their own established narrative. I personally never put too much stock into the author's words. Even leading up to the ending, I read interviews with a wary look, and thus didn't get attached to the surpassing the father idea or see any other vague apprehensions as a reliable metric. Honestly, Isayama can say whatever he wants in an interview, but it matters little when the material speaks for itself. And even cross-referencing interviews, I actually find it aiding my viewpoints even more. I never contradicted the idea that this EMA ending had been planned for some time now, but he does certainly state in 2017 that his view of the ending changed from a The Mist finale to something more peaceable. However, I believe that falling in line with what he said in another leaked interview, that at some point the plot got away from him one way or another, and that it fell outside his capabilities as a writer. This is why there is such a large tonal shift between the Rumbling arc and the previous two, and also why whenever we see vestiges of that previous thread in Eren's chapters or otherwise, they become the peak of the arc. Even the way Paths is treated goes from an ethereal, thematic manifestation that the story converges towards, to something that can be immediately rationalized, subject to Armin's shonen cliches and power of friendship. I am certain, though, that the basement reveals, Rumbling, Ymir Fritz, Eren growing up to destroy the world, was all planned out from the start because of the plot lines very inherent to the story itself from the very beginning. As Isayama advanced and matured throughout the story, it grew beyond the dynamics of Eren, Mikasa, and Armin together, in line with the original pace of the story. Eren was the only old world character that got to be a part of these new developments directly, these being best characterized in Zeke and Reiner, who he enjoyed amazingly themed relationships with. The only interactions between Eren and the other two, that being Mikasa and Armin, is constantly to put spotlight on their growing distance. This is why when Isayama opts to make Armin, and more pertinently, Mikasa, into thematically involved characters, it fails. Mikasa and her character arc has nothing to do with the greater narrative of parenthood, war, freedom, and the future of an oppressed people. Slapping the freedom from love tagline is nothing more than a shoddy veneer to keep it in place. So forth, in order to bridge this large gap that he himself had created to move towards an opposite ending, he attempted to go back on it with Eren's talk of Armin and realign his motivations, but it was already much too late. If this was the case, then the ending should have been altered in order to fit with the new expectations of the story up to that point. But Isayama stuck to his new EMA ending, and we end up with this poorly patched together finale. Eren's relation to Paths is foreshadowed consistently, both literally and thematically, from the start of the series. Armin and Mikasa's only within the last arc. Indeed, this ending would not require the fleshing out or adding of more scenes, but the removal and replacement of old scenes and their intentions from the Rumbling arc to the very start of the series itself. These scenes that would have to be removed are, however, what are most logical to the character's progression. We may look to the Paths chapters especially for this, along with Eren's entire plot thread of Historia, since the only way in which to make sense of this is by creating an entirely different ending. Essentially, Isayama had to regress the story back to its original trio, abandoning all of the bigger plot lines and ideas and trying to satisfy them on the most surface of surface levels. He made the Alliance take on some lighthearted portions of the story, despite the fact that this last arc had the largest sense of scale out of any. He says that Eren is back because Eren had grown so long from the confines of an EMA ending towards the conclusion of his character, rather than the limitations of the actual finale itself. It doesn't mean that this is the real Eren, it means that this is the Eren Isayama was internally used to and possibly wished he had written instead of the actual Eren he was always going to develop into and did develop into. This is also why we see barely any after effects of his rumbling, just some refugee camps in a single panel. May I remind you that's not just humanity that's been trampled, but also all of the land. 80% of the world is now devoid of any farmland. Even with the last 20%, they would be left with mass famine, failed states, and in general the outside world would be left as a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and possibly never even be able to recover. Instead, in 3 years, we see the world having already recovered and even advanced technologically. The problem with taking the story back this way causes this discrepancy, in which we must sideline even some of the characters, like Historia, Zeke, Reiner's true conclusion, and the entire point of a significant part of the story about genocide, racial conflict, freedom, and children, to instead replace it with a bad forced romance and provide vain hope to the Alliance, so it doesn't feel like they're fighting what's for naught, even if it really was. You know who else also created 80 to 100 years of peace at the inevitable expense of his own people? Karl Fritz. Conceptually, any ending in which Karl Fritz is the one who wins out is a terrible one. Nothing can change that. People have latched onto Isayama as a foreshadowing master so much that they read it into every little thing, doing so to an excessive degree even before the ending, and they continue to do so to justify this incredible mess just to internally deal with its contradictions. Even Isayama and his editor cannot properly bridge these incongruities, which I will explore in the next section. The thing that is disappointing me the most, however, is the virulent assault defenders of this ending have vested upon fan projects that provide alternative endings, particularly AOT no Requiem. Now, the Doujin scene is an accepted and celebrated practice within Japan, and alternative ending Doujins specifically are no new thing either. They do not compete against the original material, and there are even gatherings for Doujin publishers as well, who may also sell fan-made merchandise, and this is a fully legal practice. There are alternative ending Doujins to Naruto, Death Note, Doraemon, JoJo, and many, many more. Fans have a right to enjoy and distribute what they see fit in remembrance of their favorite series, and this is no different for the current fan projects for Attack on Titan. Even Isayama himself approved of Doujins made of his own work and said that they have made him happy. He even stated that sometimes the fans know things better than the creators. Now, I'm not going to stretch this to say that every Doujin is now canon and we have reached a death of the author situation, but it is important to keep in mind. The biggest example, AOT no Requiem, is also keeping in line with the series up to its point just fine. I don't understand the common complaints born out of misconceptions regarding Eren's character, in that it's depicting Eren as this edgy badass that he never was. The first part that's been released doesn't contain much new for Eren. In fact, a lot of the dialogue are things he had already stated within the original manga, and with true intentions to it as well. It seems that these defenders have immediately jumped to the idea that Chapter 139 Eren is the only true Eren, and everything else is a falsity, when this simply isn't the case even stated within the last chapter itself, for reasons I had already explained beforehand in my Eren section. Ironically, they have attached themselves to a false conception of Eren, and have chosen to ignore a significant part of his development. This may be either out of their own foolishness, or because they need a punching bag for their own frustrations against other fans who dare to dishonor the vision of Isayama, which is really their own vision they project onto the material and Isayama himself. The only difference between AOT no Requiem's Eren and the Eren in the canon is how the plot handles his story in the end. The original strips him of all agency and tries to limit his responsibility in a mass genocide to redeem him, and it utterly fails. At least AOT no Requiem won't cower it out. I think a problem here is that such people are those who look at media through a literal character-focused lens, the types to watch a series just for another person or title on a ranking list, rather than actually absorbing information or taking care to prod to the depths of a grand narrative. As a result, it becomes more about character wars rather than the, large-scale story centered around world-changing events. Fans have a right to enjoy these non-profit projects, and should they believe them better than the original, so what? Even now, I see AOT no Requiem as, conceptually, better than the original ending you have, because it connects more themes together into a whole and is capable of providing an altogether more satisfying conclusion to the already established canon. The original theory itself was more promising than what we ended up with. If the only difference between this Eren and that Eren is a matter of how the plot treats him towards an end, then I would pick the one that handles him into a better end rather than someone who simply services the end. However, I do not find AOT no Requiem's theory to be fully satisfying, and for a time was even more critical of it in the past, but I've grown to like it decently now. I don't think it's the best ending, and I don't think it is able to connect everything together in a 100% effective way, but it's at least got the fundamentals of the series down, and is probably the best conclusion to the work we'll be receiving. I do have my criticisms for the first part, which lie in the fact that the dialogue is too direct, and as I stated prior, it's repetitive as to what Eren has already said in the story without introducing some new facet to the lines. Eren talking to his young self is conceptually fine, but the dialogue is too on the nose, and I am ambivalent about him confronting Armin during the Zeke conversation. The conversation between Armin and Zeke is better than the original though. It's essentially the same philosophies of work, but feels more fitting to the two characters and their logical, deductive natures, rather than the original, which was conceptually fine, but too simple in execution, and riddling of plot holes surrounding its context. In the second part, I also find it to be too verbose, and has a cringy panel or two, but the ideas it presents are more fitting and biting as they should be in the context of the story. I also like the additional detail of Floch's hesitance to join up with Eren, even if it isn't particularly necessary. It does show that the writers care to fire every Chekhov's gun rather than leave a bunch of loose threads hanging, contrary to Isayama, who did exactly that as he didn't have any answers to his own story details. The art is also undeniably fantastic for a Doujin. The most ridiculous assertion is that an ending in which Eren completes a rumbling is somehow pro-genocide, and that the people who wanted for this narrative are of some problematic disposition. Such people are not only ignorant, but those who serve their own moral platitudes rather than what is given to us by the material itself and the culmination of its world. This, of course, goes into praising the Alliance as the undeniable good. Everything in the world of Attack on Titan, as written by the mangaka himself, shows mass genocide to be the only solution. Alternative plans are shown to be completely out of the question. When Isayama changed as a person and as a result decided to alter the ending itself, he still had to continue developments of the original line of the story, which are exclusive from an Alliance ending. The 50-year plan was never an option, due to Hizuru having no interest in actually opening LD up to the world and just wanted to monopolize resources. The Survey Corps' attempts to improve the position of Eldians are shown to only result in worse for Paradis. Eren only has 4 years left to live unless he releases the Titan Curse, but if he does so, then Paradis is left with nothing to defend themselves due to the 100-year technological disadvantage that they just can't bridge. Even if one activates the rumbling and destroys the world fleets, they will surely come back again, for the use of propaganda and citizen outcry in general will see monsters eviscerating their husbands and fathers just as in the past, making diplomacy impossible. On the other side, if Eren agrees to pass on his powers, he'd be leaving everyone he cares about to uncertain futures, death, and sacrifice. And who is to say a future inheritor won't be a Zeke? Eren has never been one to leave things so unresolved. To not make his choice and follow it through would be unbecoming. So, Isayama does half. This is also why his story's plotline ends so terribly, and is why the Alliance wins, and this is filled with hope. But the offer was forced to include also the rational conclusion of Alliance victory, which is the eventual destruction of Paradis. By doing this, however, it ends up cancelling out the principles his new ending was set upon by showing the Alliance's inevitable failure. Isayama ironically becomes exactly that which he used to deride, the high-standing moralists who dive right into the self-destruction of their own people, the death drive of ignorant, self-serving pacifism. The entire pro-genocide, anti-genocide argument within the fanbase where defenders of this ending attack people for becoming Jaegerists is so foolish, because people who have become Jaegerists are just people who realize the rational conclusion that the author himself put in. It constantly hammers away that there is no choice in this whole matter, no solution but a mass genocide, and it cannot be Zeke's, for his ideology is philosophically abhorrent to the fundamental base of Attack on Titan. One may want to feel that Eren is wrong for opting for a full rumbling, maybe even Isayama himself, but at no point is there any other provided answer. Eren isn't even portrayed as insane or overly villainous. He is shown as completely reasonable and fulfilling his very being. If the Eren in the past chapters were there to confront Armin in the last chapter, Armin would have no rebuttal, nothing. So it glosses over this entirely by retconning Eren's character and forcing him to have lost his mind. Isayama even acknowledges he had no way for Armin to solve this situation. Can the panels of Parody being destroyed make this any more obvious? Even without these extra panels, this was always going to be the conclusion, because at no point are we ever even shown an alternative besides moral platitudes from random characters. The fact that the Alliance were only ever even given a chance to try for peace after 80% of the world has been destroyed only backs this up and pushes these problems to the forefront. These panels are little more than reaffirmation of what Isayama had already covered across the series, because he knew he could not escape the foundations of the story itself, even if he could change the characters or falsely satisfy their arcs. These are exactly the implications that a full rumbling would avoid. Ironically, AOT no Requiem, or really any ending where Eren completes a rumbling, would convey this sort of message the original ending was aiming towards incomparably better. It would instead be a cautionary tale to let it not get to the situation of a world where freedom is so denied from a person, from an ethnic group, on account of the extreme situation of culturally ingrained racism, imperialist propaganda exploiting race politics, and so on. All of this will continue to justify itself all the while, that it inevitably births a man who would be forced to inhabit all of those built-up evils and destroy it altogether. It's not about right or wrong, selfish or selfless, but causality. This birth, this moment, this scenery, the sins of the world then concentrate into one cascade of rumbling, all in inevitability. The only way out is through. But this has its consequences, which will result in the killing of many of the audience's favorite characters, making Eren an even more controversial character a la Griffith. This is also why I think an ending that punishes Eren for completing the rumbling of Paradiso getting destroyed or Historia dying in labor is also unnecessary. It'd feel like the writer is excessively torturing a character by putting them in an unwinnable situation and coming to the only possible conclusion of the narrative, which is better surmised in it being that cautionary tale. Not to mention that a civil war in Parody would feel forced and wouldn't destroy it either. They have no Titan shifters and were shown to be fairly united for a time. This isn't to say Eren deserves no consequences, which is the toll of the full rumbling alone, and is what his battle with the Alliance is supposed to produce on a personal level. It's obviously not like human conflict would end either, but all Parody would have to deal with are all the problems of a normal nation, and Eren would still get to feel the massive weight and price of true freedom on both a personal and grand scale to empower that whole intended message better. In our original ending, apparently the rumbling came about because of Eren's childhood selfish desire, but at the same time, it is the only path for Parody's self-preservation and the only end to the fundamental conflict of the series. If we are to believe that it really was simply Eren's self-desire that provided this outcome, then what ends up making Eren's ending selfish is not that he started the rumbling, but that he didn't finish it. The tone wants to portray this for the favor of an Alliance ending, but we see the inevitable conclusion nonetheless. Would it not make more sense for it to keep Eren's desires and actions entwined as they were previously? But doing this would be exclusive from a non-rumbling ending. Ultimately, everything up to chapter 123 and the leftovers of those plot threads in 130, 131, and other panels would be the original vision of a young Isayama before he switched gears towards a different ending. Attack on Titan started officially serializing when he was 22, and he had conceptualized it long before this and had been trying to reach a publisher for some time before that. However, he most likely mellowed out after some time long afterwards, or realized the conclusion it came to contradicted his own, and opted to change the ending in line with this, which was a grave mistake, since it required the abandoning or retconning of integral plot threads. His original vision may be debatably edgier, depicting an amoral Luciferian epic, but it was infinitely more creative. AOT no Requiem seems to help to reconstruct that by actually guiding the lost plot threads to their logical narrative conclusion, and thus producing an incredibly more satisfying ending, even if it's all in their own words and depictions, obviously not 100% accurate to what it would be. The fundamental issue of this ending is that Isayama clearly wanted to please everyone, yet I don't know who is supposed to be happy with this ending. He wanted a quiet ending where the Alliance gets to live happily and try for world peace, yet he also couldn't abandon the logical and dark reality set in by the story previously. He wanted Eren to be redeemed to the general audience, but wanted to preserve his goals for any sense of story cohesion, which ends in only disappointing and wasting both angles. He wanted an EMA ending, yet he also had to do it at the expense of all the other developments that had gone past this trio. He needed to realign Ymir according to this ending, but in doing so divorced her from being the key to weaving the grand narrative altogether, along with Eren, and debased her to only being in relation to Eren and Mikasa specifically. What we see here in the ending is not a good concept given a rushed or bad execution, but a bad, unfitting concept executed to the best of its ability. The plot holes within it cannot be fulfilled without creating an altogether different ending, such as in Grisha giving the Founding Titan Historia's proper conclusion, the fate of Paradis, and Eren's motives lining up. These are all points very inherent to the structure of the story itself. If the ending can't fulfill them, then it's a conceptually flawed ending. In the end, you may be able to make a bit of sense to connect themes of this ending together within a vacuum, but it will never feel satisfying. It will leave you unfulfilled, because this can never constitute any actual climax befitting the story's scale. The fact that I, myself, could only find consummation by writing and editing this lengthy essay and behemoth of a video can attest to this directly. Hopefully, you will feel the same, either from a fan project, your own ending, other interpretations, or maybe even this video. Either way, thanks for watching.
家庭を持て。は？壁の中に入ったら初体を持つんだ。何を言ってる？俺にはダイナがいる。それにそんなことを言われても巨人になる直前の記憶はなくなるんだろう。